Chapter 19 of Mr. Wicker's Window. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Ellie. Mr. Wicker's Window by Carley Dawson. Chapter 19. The long days passed on board the Mirabelle. The hours rolled majestically past, as did the waves through which the Mirabelle cut her way. Amos and Christopher were kept out of sight, until Mr. Wicker's ship was several days out to sea, for the crew, not knowing that the success of the voyage depended on Chris, would have been surly at the presence of two such young boys on board, useless cargo in their opinion, who knew nothing of seafaring. But when Chris and Amos appeared under the banner of stowaways, the sailors considered them full of spunk and welcomed them warmly. Both Chris and Amos found life on a sailing vessel strange and fascinating, but difficult to get used to. Ned Cilley, as the best friend on board, was the one to whom they turned whenever his duties gave him free time. However, to Chris' surprise, it was the first mate, sad-looking Mr. Finney, who would patiently instruct them in sea terms and answer their endless questions. As the days passed and the Mirabelle pursued her long course through tropical water, Chris, with many free hours to occupy, at last understood how the model of the Mirabelle had been so painstakingly arranged inside a bottle, for the time seemed long between the glimpses of shore and shore, or until they sailed for a time along some wild and beautiful tropic coast. Then Chris would lean on the side of the ship, looking at the mountainous or jungled shore. A scent, such as comes from the open door of a hothouse, would drift out to the sea to the sailors, who looked yearningly toward the land and the greenness. A warm breath of flowers, damp moss, and leaves in the sun would mingle with the rough salt smell of the sea. Chris and Amos imagined to themselves what the forest or the mountainsides would be like if they could only land and investigate them. Now and again small flocks of birds, migrating perhaps or blown out to sea, would land on the Mirabelle, and Ned Cilley made a large cage for some of the sweet-singing, gaily feathered creatures for Chris and Amos. And on one occasion, when the Mirabelle was sailing past Brazil, a flock of butterflies was carried out on a breeze from shore and hung on the rigging until the boys imagined themselves in a blossoming wood. Chris had found, his first day at sea, the conch shell Mr. Wicker had mentioned, and he alone of all the Mirabelle's crew knew how the venture had fared. That first evening, in the little cabin Captain Blizzard had given Chris and Amos, Chris had waited impatiently for Amos to sleep. The two boys each had a hammock swung across the cabin by night, which they rolled up and put away to give more room by day. But that first night poor Chris had begun to despair that he would never hear Mr. Wicker's voice from the shell, for Amos was excited and had no wish to go to sleep. He swung back and forth, happy as a dark bird in his hammock, his round eyes looking toward the porthole where there was a faint gleam of night sea. "Chris," Amos said, "we are sure going on a mighty far trip. That Mr. Finney, he showed me on a map, but I never heard of any of the places where we pass by. The Bahamas, he say to me, then the West Indies, Cuba, Barbados." He was ticking them off on his fingers as he named them. "And on to South America, away down at the tippy end around, what's the name of that loud-named place?" "Cape Horn," Chris said, who was scarcely listening. Amos tried to prop himself up on his elbow and promptly fell out of the hammock in a flurry of arms and legs, and a heavy landing thump that brought a shout of laughter from Chris. After an attempt at making his bed again in the hammock and some little difficulty in clambering safely back in again, Amos composed himself with the least possible movement in his swinging bed and yawned. "I disremember," he said, "where else we are going. Wise Man Islands or Solemn Islands?" "You mean Solomon Islands?" Chris asked him. Amos gave another mighty yawn. "That's what I said. Miss Becky, she read to me from the Bible about Solomon, how wise he was." There was a pause. On that way, Amos' voice was becoming indistinct. "We go past the West Indian Islands next." Chris murmured, almost to himself, "I remember that." "And the Celebes Sea," Amos said in a whisper. "Celebes," Chris corrected softly. "What I said," came Amos' voice, and then at last there was silence in the cabin. He almost got as far as the China Sea. Chris thought to himself, and holding to the hammock, eased himself out and on bare feet went quietly to his sea chest. Its square bulk stood in the shadow of the wall, but fragments of light from the night sky caught the brass mail heads and pens upon it, that it appeared to wink cheerfully at Chris in the gloom. Slowly, to avoid any creaks that might awake Amos, Chris lifted the lid, thrust in one hand and found the shell. He held it near the small port for a moment, its rosy interior faded of color in the gray light. Then he turned it in his hand and put it in his ear. At first he heard only the rushing sound of surf on the beach, then the sea sound became fainter, and a voice so familiar that it meant home to him came to Chris's ear, as if from a long way off. "Christopher? Christopher? Here I am," came Mr. Wicker's voice. "How are you? All going well, I hope. Please do me the favor to tell the captain not to put ashore at his usual place in Tahiti, but to go by night to a cove he will find 12 leagues farther along the coast. I will tell you what to do nearer that time. You will find ample fresh water near that cove, but the Venture is up to mischief. You must escape it, and all on board the Mirabelle shall be witnesses to what Claggett Chew plans to do." The voice faded out and then returned. "You would probably like to know how far behind the Venture is. She ran aground, most unfortunately and most surprisingly, and is 3 full days behind you, but she is a fast ship and will soon lessen the distance. Please to tell the captain so. He is the only one who knows my gifts, and that it is possible for me to communicate with you. Tell him not to stop for water or food until his stores are running low. You must not waste time. Have you heard me? Tap the edge of the shell 3 times for yes." Chris tapped 3 times, feeling much happier and all at once not quite so much alone. The voice came back to his ear. "I am following your progress from this room in the manner you know. Practice your magic alone, or you will lose the knack. And now good night. Oh yes, Becky Boozer has been crying into her apron all day, partly for Ned Cilley, I fancy." Chris heard a chuckle from a well-remembered room. "But I fancy largely for 2 boys. Good night, Christopher. Sleep well." End of chapter 19. Recording by Ellie, August 2009.